Hello, and welcome to my presentation, Lucen, Indie Game Dev with Houdini and Unreal Engine 4. My name's Chris, and Lucen is the game I'm solo developing. It's an adventure game where you harness light with your sword on a quest to ask the old gods for help restoring light to your darkness-shrouded village. I've been working on it for the past 8 months and have been predominantly using Houdini for producing all manner of 3D assets, models, rigging and animations, visual effects, as well as some tools to use in the Unreal editor for creating and populating landscapes and set dressing. A bit of background on me. I'm from Australia and previously worked as an effects artist in feature film on titles such as Aquaman and Spiderman Far From Home. Game dev has always been my dream though, and after dabbling on and off for a while and seeing how much I could use Houdini for, I decided to take the leap last year and quit my job in effects to pursue game dev full time. Here are some of the topics I'm going to cover in this presentation. For modeling, I'm going to show some procedural techniques for rapid asset creation, as well as implementing simulation into the modeling process. For animation and rigging, I'm going to show some rigging of complex models and talk a little bit about biharmonic capture. For visual effects, I'll cover some vertex animation, vector fields, and how to get them into Unreal Engine, as well as talk a little bit about attributes. Houdini Engine, what it is, how I'm using it to create landscapes and procedurally place things, and how you can augment the environmental geometry using set dressing with it. Let's get started with modeling. So for this scene, I'll go through a little bit about how I made the various elements. For the brick walls and columns, I had a few parameters that I needed the geometry to address. I needed to be able to rapidly create variations, have some sort of chipping process, stone material type, so I need to bake the ambient occlusion and curvature to use inside the material. And I want to fracture the columns to be able to vary their height and have a few models with variation. Here's what the node graph looks like for that. The first portion is for stacking the bricks, second portion is for chipping, and the third is just the baking and exporting. I'll start from here. There are a few resources online that will cover getting to this point. But this is a basic brick wall. It's one polybeveled box using a few copy and transform nodes to stack it up and across. I then pack each piece with an assemble node to add a bit of offset with point jitter and unpack right after. To start the chipping process, we need to iterate in a for each over each individual brick. I then divide the geo to get more resolution and use the noise on the point positions. I then poly reduce this a little and boolean fracture the original brick against it. This will create the chipping effect. I create a fog VDB from the original brick, and then I assemble the geometry into pack pieces and sample their position with a volume sample. This lets me cull the pieces relative to their volume depth, and has been the most efficient and edge case free method I've found for chipping procedurally. Now to add some more breakup around the edges, I do a similar thing but using a smoothed and noise version. I got this technique from a presentation Scott Keating did in 2017. There's some great info in that if you look it up. This will break up the sharp edges and it gives it a weathered effect. And here's what the final wall looks like when each brick has been iterated over. Because the noise is a world space, you don't need to do any per piece variation because the noise takes care of that. To finish up, I create a box referencing the height and width of the wall, and bake it with the maps from the Side Effects Labs nodes. These nodes are a must-have for game dev. They're an incredible collection of tools. Make sure you add the shelf and install them. Shout out to Paul and Lewis and anyone else working on them, they're game-changing. Here I'm baking the ambient occlusion, curvature, and normals to use inside the material in Unreal Engine. For the columns, I'm using the same kind of technique for the chipping, so I'll just show how I got the base shape and a few nodes. Started with a tube, I poly-extruded and inset it with a negative value, then polybeveled the faces slightly, extruded those and add normals, and that's it. And here's the material in Unreal, being driven with a noise texture and the ambient occlusion and curvature maps. I wanted to be able to procedurally weather the geometry through parameters, though of course you can just bake this into the diffuse for better performance. Now I'll go over some techniques I used to make this Cthulhu head statue. For the tentacles, I needed to approach this in a way that wouldn't require crazy sculpting of individual tentacles, because that would be super time consuming and I'm not the greatest sculptor. So I'm leveraging Houdini for this. I first created a curve as the base for the tentacle. I then ramped a p-scale along the curve with a ramp on the curve U in a wrangle and fed that into a polywire. Then I took it to ZBrush, sculpted a little and brought it back. To rig it, I used the same base curve to create some bones. I then did a vellum sim attracting some pinned lines in a hair sim to a sphere. The hairs all have the same p-scale as the original curve I used to make the shape, so they will respect the tentacle's correct thickness at every point along the curve. I then used follow curve IK on the bone chain and tied which curve the IK followed to the frame number. That way I only had to rig one tentacle. Then trailing it for 11 frames gives me this. Then it's just a case of exporting back to ZBrush and sculpting it onto the head. For the pillar that the head sits on, I modeled some basic shapes and beveled the edges. Then I used overlapping grids to Boolean fracture it, and using the delete small parts labs node, it gives me some cool chipping through it. I then used labs voxel mesh on each piece individually to get more resolution and smooth the result so that the finer fractures become more visible. And here's what it looks like in game. Now I'll show some techniques from this cave scene. So for the cave rocks, my goal approaching this was to have a process that I could feed any input shape and receive a stylistically consistent output. For the pillars, I started with a curve and varied a width attribute along it slightly. I then polywire this and add some noise. And after converting it to VDB, I add the detail noise in a volume VOP. This solves the problem of stretching geometry, because it applies the noise on a volume instead of the geo. This way, I don't have to perpetually worry about pushing the noise too far and stretching the geometry. Here's the VOP setup. I'll show you each node's settings individually so that you can see exactly how it's set up. You can change all sorts of things in here and lay in more noises to get different shapes and different levels of complexity. So I start with an anti-alias noise, fit that to a range, feed that into a unified noise with a Wall-E noise, fit that again, and then multiply it by minus 0.25, add it to the surface field, and then bind export that surface field. After converting back to polygons from volume, I polyreduce and use a labs auto UV. Then I save it as an FBX, and this goes out to Substance Painter, where I apply a smart material. For the hanging vines, I use the same vine setup as for other vine stuff. The input is a bent grid that I paint on. I then delete the non-painted areas and use some connect adjacent pieces stuff. A find shortest path then works from top to bottom based on some groups and point sort. I then scatter some points, offset them a bit, and add some random rotation. Here's how I'm constructing the orientation to the points before copying grids to them. So first, I construct a matrix from 3 vectors based on the normal and the tangent. I then add some random rotation for the y and x axes. And then I create the orientation attribute from that matrix. I do the same thing for the flowers. And here's how they're positioned around the edge of the opening inside Unreal. The trees are something I got a lot of questions on early on, so I have a full tutorial that I made that's available on YouTube for how to make these from scratch in Houdini and also the portion in Unreal. So I'll just briefly cover them. I'm modifying the fantastic Labs Quick Tree node to do a few things differently and expose a few different parameters. I can then create reference copies for each LOD and multiply certain values to lower the resolution, leaf density, and change the p-scale, etc. So here are the different LODs. Animation. So I'll talk a little bit about my animation process and why I choose Houdini. So why Houdini? People sometimes seem a bit surprised that I'm doing all my animating in Houdini, so here are a couple of reasons. The bones and constraints are incredibly straightforward to set up. With my existing knowledge of Houdini, it was very quick to learn and it's super intuitive. It ties in with created assets, like with the tentacles for instance, where I used the base curve to create the bones and then drove them with the simulated vellum curves. This provides an unprecedented level of procedural control that I can leverage. It's really easy to create a parameter control interface to drive all the transforms and custom blends, and I'll show you that in a second. Biharmonic capture. Biharmonic capture is the best bone capture technique for mesh skinning out there. It uses a tetrahedral mesh to compute the weights for the bones, so you get nice volume-based weighting off the bat. I often barely need to touch the weights once the auto capture does its thing, sometimes not at all, depending on what I'm rigging. And chops. Chops is a big plus. It can add great secondary and tertiary movement like jiggle very cheaply and easily, as well as various other effects. I won't be covering that today though. Here's another example of just how easy rigging based on curves is. It was about 60 seconds in real time to set this up, and it gave me something nice and usable. It's the perfect candidate for something like a character's hair or the tentacles that I showed previously. Here's my character rig with a combo animation. Please excuse my rudimentary animation ability. In the parameter interface here, I have switches for displaying things like bones and controls, as well as tabs with transforms for all aspects of the rig. It's incredibly quick to set these up, and I highly recommend Michael Goldfarb's rigging tutorial series if you're looking into animation in Houdini. Again, here's another rig. For this one, I have a few more arcade controls and constraints so that I can move the body independently of the head independently of the body, etc., so that I can get that nice chicken head stabilization effect. Visual effects. It's no surprise that, as Houdini's bread and butter for feature film, it also excels at VFX for games. Vertex animation textures. They're really a game changer. You can bring pretty much any imagined effects to fruition with this. Again, shout outs to the lab guys for implementing this in such a pain-free way. You can also use Houdini to easily create effects meshes for panning textures on and warping them to your desire. Solar coasters, cylinders, you name it. One thing I found pretty cool is saving out attributes as vertex color. This is especially handy with vertex animation fluids, where you don't have a consistent point order or proper UVs. Making vector fields is a one-click solution thanks to Labs nodes. It'll take a point cloud and bake the velocities out to a format that's readable by Unreal. Niagara integration. I won't be covering this, but you can save Houdini attributes to a file and import it as a CSV asset, letting you use Houdini particle sim attributes inside Niagara. So for the spider hatching effect, I created an egg and Voronoi fractured it. I then used a sphere as a bounding geometry to group certain pieces and be able to control their active value and set it to 1, while leaving others at 0 so they'll stay static in the RBD sim. I made some simple constraints with a connect adjacent pieces node. And then after animating the spider and using it as a collision geometry, this is what it looks after it's been simulated. For the fluid, I made some points inside the egg and removed portions based on noise. And once the fluid's been simmed, meshed, and polyreduced, this is how it looks. To get this into Unreal, I'm using the Labs Vertex Animation texture ROPs and making one for the rigid sim, one for the fluids, and one for the spider. This is what the interface looks like. In the method section, you choose whether it's soft, rigid, fluid, etc. You set the target texture size here, and here's the sample shader code. Depending on which method you chose, you'll get a shader code that you copy and paste into an Unreal Material function. You just copy this straight from the Houdini ROP right into a function in Unreal, and it will create all the nodes for you. Here's an example. All you need to do is feed the connections to the relevant pins on a make material attributes, and the function's done. Once you add the function to your material, it should look something like this. You can create a time and speed parameter, and then you plug in the textures that have been spat out by the ROP. Here are the fields that you need to use to populate your material instance. You need to set the frame range, the speed, and the position min and max. and that's going to inform the material for the bounds of the effect, as well as how long to run it for and the speed, etc. And here's that shot again. Because I didn't want to mess around with perfectly animating the root bone of the spider to make it line up inside the engine, I'm freely animating from the hips instead and saving it as an FBX. And then I'm bringing that as a vertex animation too. Then I'm performing a switch inside the blueprint as the spider lands, so that when it's jumping out, it's a vertex animation, but as it lands, it switches to the skeletal mesh and the blueprint takes over for the AI. To create the vector field for the embers, I do a particle sim and then cull by a bounding box to make the domain the desired size. I then export this using the labs vector field node. Here's how it looks in the particle system in Unreal. I'm using a local vector field to bring in the vector field, and inside the shader I'm driving the flames with some the attributes that I wrote out to the vertex color, so that you can change the flame height, intensity, etc. Houdini engine. The concept can be a bit elusive, but I like to sum it up like this. It's a plugin that takes your Houdini node graph and cooks it in editor. You can expose parameters and feed in things from the world outliner as inputs, and much more. This video is a vine tool that allows you to grab geometry from your world that has been painted on using Unreal's built-in vertex color painting. It then uses this to create vines crawling across the geometry. I got this idea from an old video and asset posted by Side Effects and decided to make my own version. The gist of the vine tool is the same as what I showed previously in the cave scene. You paint along the geometry and then you grow vines along the painted areas. I then offset them from the surface based on their p-scale and a push amount for clearance. And then I use a polywire with the thickness driven by the curve view. The leaf cards have the normals of the geometry I painted on transferred to them for a smoother look in engine. Here's a clip of its basic use in Unreal. So I drag the tool into the viewport, apply it to the painted geometry, and then I have a few settings that I can change in the tool. Change the leaf density, the min and max size of the vines, etc. And when I'm done, I apply the final material. Here's another thing I use the vine tool to make. The vertex color is being used to drive the UV scale and opacity to grow the vines. I've got a full breakdown of this on YouTube as well, and it dives into the guts of the vine tool too. Here's my process for landscape creation in Houdini and Unreal. Using a Houdini digital asset, it makes it easy to populate your landscape with objects inside Unreal. Here's what the node graph looks like for the landscape. This landscape in particular doesn't demand much, so there are no erosion nodes or terracing, etc. In the bottom half is where I'm scattering proxy geometry to then switch out for Unreal objects later. Here's the landscape with the masks created for the grass, and here it is with the proxy geo scattered. And once you save it as an HDA and cook it in Unreal, it's a matter of switching these objects for any Unreal actor you like. I'm using it to scatter trees, rocks, etc., but you can also use it for placing enemies, sounds, and other blueprints or Unreal Engine actor types. When you're happy with it, you can bake to actors or foliage, etc. Baking to foliage will allow you to paint or remove with the foliage tool. You can then also bake the landscape actor, and once that's done, you can remove the Houdini asset from the outliner. The great part about using this workflow in Houdini is that you can still go in and sculpt the landscape or add different foliage types, paint the landscape layers, remove foliage. It doesn't preclude you from making any bespoke changes inside the editor at all. So you can use this as a framework and then go in and change things as much as you like. So let's recap. Went over some modeling, both procedural and simulated approaches, some animation and rigging, my reasons for using Houdini, went over some visual effects, and it's hands down the most powerful DCC for visual effects for games. Vertex animation textures, huge game changer. And we went over Houdini engine, how it can assist your workflow and improve speed greatly. I often get asked to point people in the right direction for resources and where they should get started. So In general, CG Wiki is one of the most incredible resources for Houdini. It's maintained by Matt Estella, who's a legend. He has examples of so many different things on there. If you need to figure out how to do something specifically in Houdini, chances are he's made a HIP file example of that and a little GIF to go along with it. Side effects. Definitely check out their YouTube and Vimeo channels as well as their website. The tutorials section has tons and tons of tutorials. In Tagma, they do a lot of really motion design oriented stuff, but there are some super cool techniques in there that definitely can apply to games. Rohan Delvey, he has a Vimeo channel as well as some paid tutorials. He makes really good content and has been doing so for quite a while. In terms of forums, Side Effects' forum, of course, as well as Oddforce. Oddforce has been around for ages. It's a great source of information. If you have a problem, chances are someone else has run into it and they've posted about it there. The Houdini Artists and Houdini for GameDev Facebook groups are really good for connecting with the community, sharing your work, and getting feedback. Definitely would recommend. There's tons of pros in both of those groups that will help you. For modeling specifically, Simon Houdini has insanely good tutorials. He's making a lot of tutorials that are available on YouTube and the Side Effects website. I would highly recommend him. It's all game dev oriented. IndiePixel also makes some awesome tutorials. For animation, I hands down recommend Michael Goldfarb's rigging tutorials. I've learned so much from going through those, and it really helped me understand the ins and outs of animation inside Houdini. For visual effects, Andreas Glad has some awesome tutorials. I would highly recommend checking those out. If you're in the market for paid courses, CJ Spectrum is a school that I studied with. I studied with them for 6 months before getting hired in the visual effects industry. Their one-on-one mentorships are really good. It was great to be able to have a pro that I could go back and forth with and ask for really specific help on problems that I was facing. CGMA, I've heard some pretty good things about them, and the guys that are making content for them are really good. And Stephen Nipping's tutorials. While they're not game dev oriented specifically, you can definitely apply the concepts learned there, and he goes really in depth showing how to do simulations of like volumes, particles, fluids, rigid bodies. He's fantastic. Definitely check his stuff out. And that's it. Thanks for watching. I hope you found something useful here. And my Twitter is @LucenGame if you want to check out the game and see what I'm doing with Houdini. Cheers.